Hi, this is Paul. Last week during, I think, the live stream, someone mentioned this video that it had dropped and it was interesting. And so it caught my interest and I've listened to most of it now. And it is an interesting video. I think I didn't know anything about John Rich, know a little bit more about him now listening to the video. I haven't listened to the Daily Wire extended thing. But there's a lot of interesting things in this video that sort of touch on a lot of what we're dealing with right now in a variety of ways. Now, I thought, well, what's the easiest way to get into this video? Probably this particular section of the video I heard this morning will probably elicit a number of the items that I want to look at. Now, I think actually Jordan Peterson does a great job in this interview. I haven't fully listened to the Elon Musk conversation. I didn't think he was too frenetic, a little too involved, too little excitable, interrupted too much. I thought he was really terrific in this. It's so interesting watching the different modes of Peterson in these conversations. And in this conversation, he was much more, again, back to sort of the inquisitive therapist mode, where he's got a lot of questions. He's not so much trying to push, talk about his new book or throw too much Bible at them, but really a good, appreciable inquiry to try and get a sense of this. Now, of course, one of the things that becomes very clear is that John Rich is sort of in evangelist mode in this, and even the little clip that Jordan singled out as a clip on his main channel was very much John doing what I think a whole bunch of people have wanted to do to Jordan, but I think it basically had the impact that anybody who's watched Jordan long enough, whether it's the Catholics making their appeal or someone making their appeal to Jordan kind of sits back and listens and, I've heard what you said and here's some of the points that I have, but, there's that. So I thought overall, in terms of a conversation, I thought it was really well done. Now I'm going to play this section and get into this section where I think there are a number of interesting issues that are salient right now in the larger conversation in the culture. Now, the thing that seemed to have elicited this was this song called Revelation that John Rich created and produced, and he talks about the fact that he could create it because he's now independent from the three major media enterprises, Warner, Sony, Universal. He's independent from them, and he's saying how they control Nashville, and then he could do this. And so immediately when I saw where this was going, I went over and I watched the video, and it immediately sort of reminded me of Carmen and some of that stuff that went out. Carmen's The Champion or Frank Peretti's This Present Darkness, very much along that vibe. And if you don't know who Frank Peretti is in This Present Darkness, you can probably see a little bit of I'm sure if you Google it and find out about it. It was a book that was written in, when was that book written? Okay, the book was written in 86. Yeah, I thought it was 80s because I was college. Those are college seminary days. And the book, it was a fun book. And I remember when the book came out, at least in terms of the mid 80s young adult Christian scene, the book was just like nothing we'd ever read before. It was sort of the Iliad for 1980s Christians who wanted to imagine spiritual warfare. I've mentioned the book before. It sold a lot of copies, and it sort of really created an entire industry. There was a sequel, Piercing the Darkness, but This Present Darkness just really got this present dark. I was just reading something. I thought, who was that? Frank Peretti? No, was a character in the book. This book just really grabbed the imagination, and when I saw this song Revelation, it reminded me of on one hand, it sort of reminded me of Johnny Cash's When the Man Comes to Town, sort of mixed with Frank Peretti. And I have to confess that when they started with this kind of thing, I just thought, especially given all the conversation that we've had around, okay, what do we mean by spirit? What are principalities and powers? I think that has, at least around this corner, that has developed quite a bit more than, let's say, the representations that I found in the video, which seemed, it sort of, I couldn't help but it reminded me of that Netflix show with the vampires on the little island off of Maine. I was kind of thinking, this is kind of what this has become. And so I thought, not didn't really grab me. I thought what was interesting was how he framed all of this.
Wrote the song in November. In February of 24, we shot this video, which if people haven't seen this video, I urge you after this interview to go find it. It's just look up John Rich Revelation and you'll find it. And the video is depicting spiritual warfare. It's depicting.
Now I like the song. I did like the song, but the video, I mean, this kind of thing, I thought. Again, it gets into one of the big conversations we've been having in this corner about what do you mean by spirit? And okay, this is a representation of it, of course, but
what's going on the other side of what the Bible calls the veil. If you could see on the other side of the veil, what would that look like? What would it look like to see good and evil actually battling it out outside of the physical realm? So the video is actually my attempt anyway of showing people what it would look like if that was happening. So we got that.
The funny thing, of course, is what it looks like is exactly what it looks like. Now, if you go a little further in the video, things get a little Gnostic. Let's see if I can find it. Now, Jordan here asks a very question because, part of what we're going to get into is sort of John Rich's moral compass. And I've mentioned before that one of the important things to understand about Jordan, especially talked about this a lot more early on, 2016, 2017, 2018. For Jordan, meaning is sort of a gyroscope, in that a gyroscope is something that can sort of guide you. And if you look for what's meaningful, you sort of follow it, and meaning will lead you into truth. And now Jordan isn't going to, I think, push on that too hard, but that's sort of always been underneath a lot of Jordan's stuff on meaning. And John Rich is fairly dogmatic earlier in this video, and I think we'll play a little bit of that. We'll go back to that. But with respect to sort of his picture of the world, which kind of comes up with this video that sort of looks like Frank Peretti, John Rich sort of explains at least his take on a Christian worldview here.
It's different than pursuing your own short-term interests, but that doesn't mean, you can be deluded about that. So how do you know? How do you test your own motivation to determine whether what you're doing is truthful or just another snare of deception?
Well, see, I think one place with respect that I think you are wrong on this subject and that you miss it is that you think human beings have the capability to decide between left, right, truth, lie, all these things that are going on, and we're just not capable of it. I'll put it to you this way. I am not looking at the real Jordan Peterson. I'm looking at what Jordan Peterson lives in for a while. You're not looking at John Rich. I just live in this thing for a while. The real Jordan.
Now, again, if you get into a little bit of the, recent, did I make videos about this, or was I just watching videos about this? But you get into these, it was Alex O'Connor, and I still haven't made a video about him and Peugeot. I still want to do that. He had a very interesting conversation with Bart Ehrman about Gnosticism. And okay, the real Jordan Peterson isn't you. It's something that's sort of living inside of you. And this is where things get a little bit Gnostic-y here for him. And that's not unusual in certain corners of Christianity in North America.
Jordan Peterson lives forever. He's an eternal being. He was created by the Creator, and he was put in that body that you're in right now to last as long as it's going.
So now we have a pre-existent Jordan Peterson. It's like, well, some of these ideas were in the burned over district of upstate New York and sort of got carried over into the LDS theology, where, all the souls are pre-existent and all the souls are eternal, and then the soul gets placed in a body. And I mean, he's basically saying that, which I thought, oh, this is interesting.
Going to last, and then that body is going to die, and then the real Jordan is released from that body. Same way it goes for me.
So you sort of have a little Gnostic secret sacred self here going.
So the only way a human being can discern what is true and what is a lie is you better have Jesus inside of you, because he's the ultimate truth. So when things come in,
so then we got our bodies are these husks, and these eternal. Now he said eternal. These eternal souls get put in, and I guess you put little Jesus right next to it in your little body, and it's almost Pacific Rim. And again, this is a long-standing conversation within American Christianity between, let's say, an embodied person where, my soul isn't that something that's in me. That's sort of the wrong framing in terms of thinking about what my soul is and who I am, and being an embodied, a living nephesh. So I just thought that was super interesting when he got to this point, and it was like, this is interesting where you're going, but that's not the focus of this. I was more interested in the earlier portion. We'll go back there. Okay, so now what we want to do is sort of represent behind the veil, and watching this, I was thinking again, I've just been to Italy, and I've been in all these churches, and you had all of these Renaissance pictures. Maybe I'll bring one up. So here's just a random one. Why is everything gold up top? Well, everything is gold up top because that's sort of outside the age of decay, because gold doesn't decay, it doesn't tarnish, it's and that's part of the reason why often the ceilings, the heavens of cathedrals, like the one in Venice, as opposed to some other ones, are covered in gold, because it doesn't decay. And then you have halos, you have sort of gold around people, and that symbolizes that they're sort of connected with eternity. And of course, you've got sort of Jesus looking down from above here, and you've got, this is Renaissance, so you've got things down below that are sort of here in the seculum, and you've got things that are eternal up above. And of course, in his theology, your soul is that little bit of, it's just fascinating, just sort of tracking how these things work. I'm still looking for my eternity here. Okay, so here's a fresco on a wall of a chapel, and so you have praying here below. And up here you can see the angels, and they're sort of opening up this window to heaven. And you have sort of the cherubs are some of the funniest, most interesting, because they're innocents. Are those little souls? How do you want to think about that? But here the angels are sort of pulling open the veil, and of course, here you're going to find usually Mary as kind of an intermediary who's making the connection, and the person, the saint praying here below. And here you have sort of in the seculum, you have the terrestrial world, and here you have the behind the veil. Well, there it is, and there's God the Father at the very highest, and the little rendering. And notice it's of course all gold inside, because that's the heavenly. And the angels doing their work to open it up and administer, and then of course the cherubs in there. So back to his story.
What's going on the other side of what the Bible calls the veil? If you could see on the other side of the veil, what would that look like? What would it look like to see good and evil actually battling it out outside of the physical realm? So the video is actually my attempt anyway of showing people what it would look like if that was happening. So we got that done. And then the thought was, okay, how do we get this out there? Because I don't have a record deal. I don't have a publishing deal. I don't work for anybody, doctor, nobody.
Well, of course, we have social media today, so no more intermediators, no more gatekeepers.
Which I used to think was a bad thing. You know, when you grow up your whole life and your American dream is, I want to land a big record deal. I want to be on country radio. I want to write hit songs, which I did all those things. And so to not be on a record label, to step away from that industry, at the time seemed like a terrible thing. But what I've realized, especially with a song like Revelation, is that if I still had a record deal, if I was still answering to a big company, this song would have never been heard by anyone. They would have taken this song, shoved it off on a shelf and said, okay, cool song, John, what else you got? They would have never promoted this. So,
And I think he's right. I think he's right. Now, what's interesting is that we're having our Estuary Sunday and we're talking about the fact that a 6-year-old left to his own impulses might not go to school, wouldn't go to church, might eat Captain Crunch and ice cream all the time, might play video games all the time, do a little bit of damage. 25-year-old, without any supervision, without any formation, without any things around them, might be a lot more destructive. Unwed, children born out of wedlock, doing drugs all the time, driving fast in cars, doing other reckless things. Who knows? And so we talked about this balance between, and Peterson talks all the time about culturally just sort of giving ourselves over. He doesn't use Christian language. He just talks about basically our basic hedonistic whims. Christians sort of then translate that into this other register of our epithumia, our evil desires. And so what's interesting about this conversation is, of course, the relationship between, let's say, supervision, but that supervision can be record companies that want to work out of a motivation for profit, or record companies that, let's say, if you go back and when Peterson was talking to this one comedian, what was his name? Andrew Schultz. Maybe I got his first name wrong. But, he was talking about the atmosphere. And, of course, record companies are always looking at the atmosphere. And a big part of what has happened with social media and the internet is, of course, there's no more gatekeepers. And these gatekeepers can be there for good or for ill. Sometimes a gatekeeper is really important because they might stop you from doing something you shouldn't do. Sometimes the gatekeeper might stop you from doing something you should do. And again, we have this sort of fall of institutions around us.
I don't have that physical machine behind me, but I do have a spiritual machine behind me. And I did what he told me to do. He gave me the song.
And even how he framed, I don't have the physical machine behind me, whereas you could say, well, Sony, Universal, Warner, are they physical? They're not really physical. They're more, let's say, they're hyper objects. We could use that language. They're non-corporeal. They certainly have corporeal manifestations. And again, as I'm bringing this out, you can begin to see what has happened in the conversation, let's say around this little corner, how we have this whole new language, we have this whole new sensibility, where we can begin to make differentiations. When I listen to him talk, I hear a lot of Christian language that I was very familiar with, and I know many of you will be very familiar with it. For me, it was in the 1980s, and now that I listen to it talk, it's sort of like starting to sort of piece it apart. Now again, to Jordan's credit, Jordan doesn't sort of bring in all this stuff because Jordan, of course, knows it, and because he's spoken it quite a bit over the last few years. And he just sort of, I think, and again, an appreciable inquiry, just sort of continues to ask questions to let John Rich sort of express himself, because it's really important. I think it's really helpful to just hear what John Rich thinks and to watch how he frames it and hear how he puts it together.
He told me to make it as great as I could. I did that. Then he said, blast it out there. So I did that. So at that point, I said, all right, what's on you now? Let's do what you will.
And of course, John Rich very much believes that God has given him this message and this mission, and he's to go out and do it. And it's on you now. Of course, it's up. And I'm not going to critique that or criticize that at all. He's certainly sincere in it. Is he right? can't judge. I'm not going to judge him in terms of what God told him to do. I'm not skeptical about God. I'm not skeptical that God told him to do. Again, as a Christian minister, all the time you have people coming to you saying, well, I think God is calling me to do this. Okay, well, I'm not going to necessarily get in your way. I might have questions. I might have doubts. I might have all of those things. But, you know, who am I to get between you and your maker on this?
You're my booking agent and you're my marketing director. So have at it, boss. And next thing I know, doctor, this thing has got millions and millions of views. Tucker Carlson is calling. I'm going on his show, did his show. People like yourself start reaching out and going, hey, let's talk about this for a minute. And then online, it's unbelievable what has happened with this.
Now, and it's easy to get cynical with something like this, but I don't think you should get cynical with something like this, because you can understand it through a lot of different frames. One of the frames is that in terms of the public domain, one of the things that, let's say, the principalities and powers in the public view have wanted to do is sort of, well, let's sort of move that old-time Christianity over to the side. Well, you move it to the side, it doesn't mean there isn't a market for it. In fact, there's all sorts of markets for this. A number of years ago, there was a long-running show on television called Supernatural that was, it wasn't sort of a Christian. It was sort of a Hollywood. Hollywood just usually takes, let's take a little bit of this from the Roman Catholics, maybe borrow a little here, borrow a little there, kind of throw it in, and let's make a movie and have, angels and demons and spirits and vampires and werewolves, and let's just put them all together, and, sort of like a kid who's playing in their room and they have all these action figures from different stories, and they put them all together and they have them fight, and that's what a lot of this is doing. But of course he's
and I think that speaks to the nature of where it came from, that it was thrust upon me. And trust me, it's somewhat of an unnerving experience to take a song like that about that subject and just blast it right out, especially knowing how our culture works these days, and how much pushback you're going to get from people or look at you funny or whatever. But nevertheless, I was told to do it, so I did it. So that brings us to this conversation where, to me, the song is what it is. And it says a lot. I mean, it says a whole lot. And we can go through those lyrics. What it's really done.
Now, I want to talk a little bit about hard-line-ism, because that's definitely a spirit that's at work around the world. And it's sort of a compensating spirit for, let's say, the soft-line-ism that has had, in some ways, the political, in some ways, not always, sort of the political hegemony and the priority. There's something sort of internally thrilling about hard-line-isms, where here is the line, it's bright, it's fixed, it's right here, and there's something heaven and hell. It's something antithetical. It's something that rouses us. It feels meaningful, and off we go. Now, someone can, let's say, on an Islamic channel, with the rise of Islamism and, people back during the ISIS days when people were flying from Western Europe to Syria in order to, participate in ISIS that was growing, or when the Ukrainian war broke out, you had people flying from all over the world. They were sort of motivated because suddenly, when there appears a line, it motivates people all over to sort of show up on that line and take sides on that line, and this is just sort of a perennial human thing. And again, I'm not critiquing it or criticizing it. I think this is part of our nature, and I think often a good part of our nature. There should be lines, and there should be moments when a line is crossed where you stand up and take a stand, and so on and so forth. And of course, I was listening to Jordan's talk with Michaela, and I always love it when he talks to his family members, because hi kiddo, and it's just really warm, a father talking to his daughter about this stuff. And I had a big fight with my wife, partly because I was frustrated about this stuff, and that kind of transparency and honesty good for him. He's not, putting up a facade. But again, we're also dealing with sort of a sincerity culture of inherited values and an authenticity culture of sort of felt identity centered values. And you can see both of these things kind of at play in this, because on one hand, there's sort of a back to this old time religion, which of course, as every generation goes, it doesn't really get further back. It just sort of is always kind of steps with you. Because actually, if you go back 100 years, there's all kinds of weirdness back there that's back there. If you read, let's say, primary documents, and you sort of sort that weirdness and select other pieces of it, and those get carried forward with you. But it's just there's just an interesting dynamic going on here about, well, I didn't want to be encumbered by these gatekeepers anymore. I wanted to, and I can translate this into, let's say, expressive individualist language. I mean, I can translate almost everything he says into expressive individualist language, with the exception of, let's say, some of the boundary marker points that he holds. But, I needed to follow my heart. I needed to follow my passion. I mean, he could have used all of that language, and functionally it kind of works the same. But no, he's listening to his conscience. And I like what Jordan does with conscience later on here. Right when he came back from his coma, he was talking a lot about conscience, and you can really see how his ideas of conscience have developed. But again, it's interesting, the interplay between, let's say, the individual self of calling the hero's journey at the wedding villa at my son's wedding. It was a lovely place, and someone from the place came in every morning and put out a little breakfast buffet for us to eat from, and I was sitting there with some members of my family. We're eating breakfast. I'm a big lover of breakfast, and one young man, his wife was back in the room. He says, I'm here on the hero's journey getting coffee. It just cracked me up. It's my hero's journey. I actually have to get up and get dressed and get out of bed and go get coffee and bring coffee back to my wife. My wife is staying in bed to drink coffee, but I'm on the hero's journey. I actually got up for it.
And it crowbarred the door open just enough where we get to have the big conversation, the really big, more than just a 3.5-minute song. We get to go.
And I like this point. I like this point too, because those gatekeepers, sort of in the secular era, and again, earlier in the video, Jordan does, I think, a nice job of sort of teasing through, well, sometimes it's important if you have someone you're working for to hit that mark. But I think his point he's making here is that in the secular frame, there's always sort of we don't really want to raise these big issues. We don't really want to talk about things like hell. The song is all about hell and Judgment Day. So we're gonna sort of push these things over to the side. And this I thought was an excellent point, where he says Sony and Universal and Warner are not wanting me to make a song about hell.
Go in depth now and talk about what that song really means and where we really are today.
Well, let's do that. I got a couple of questions from what you just said, but then I would like to walk through it lyric by lyric and discuss that. I think that would be very, very interesting. And
again, I love it when Jordan is in this mode. He's listening well. He's taking notes. In this case, of course, he's not a clinician who is working with a patient, but in a sense, he's an investigator working almost with a far larger spiritual mural, and he's gaining access to it through John Rich in this case, and he's sort of bringing things out, and he's poking, and he's asking questions. I thought that this was really good.
Some piano improvisation, for what it's worth, and one of the things I've noticed that's quite strange is that if I haven't played for a while and I sit down, I usually have something new right at hand. It's as if there's something operating in the background that's continually working that I'm not really aware of, but that's available. Like I only play, I suppose, every.
And that's true of making videos. You know, I was running a little organization with my buddy Kevin Adams called Sierra Leadership Network for a while, and we were basically teaching lay preachers, because we always need extra preachers around for when pastors go on vacation and such. And what's really fun about lay preachers is someone wants to preach, and they sort of have all this pent up stuff, and then they really feel God has put this message on their hearts, and they find a Bible verse that sort of goes with the message, and they're all excited about it. And so, of course, when you do lay preaching, you say, all right, well, write this sermon, and they'll might write something out or do something, and then, okay, in the classroom context, you go ahead and preach that, and we'll listen to it. And I mean, they're just bursting, and the whole thing comes, and it's like, okay, well, let's maybe add a little structure to this, and maybe some illustrations. And so you work with them for a long time on this sermon, and they're really excited about that, because hopefully if you're doing a good job, they can see that you're helping them able to deliver this message and improve and help audience to grasp it. And so you work and you work and you work, and they finally then get this one sermon crafted, and then they get an opportunity. You're going on vacation, say, okay, you've been working on this sermon. I won't be at Livingstone's. I want you to come to Livingstone's, and I want you to preach that sermon. They're all excited. In the Christian Reformed Church, you can preach a sermon if the council basically sees a text in advance and gives permission, or usually, if even councils usually might not even go through that whole step. But if I said, yeah, I've read the sermon, it's okay, the council says, oh, okay, it's probably all right. So then they come to church, and then they preach the sermon, and whoosh, they get the whole thing out. And then we have our next meeting. It's like, okay, let's start working on the next one. Next one, I spent 20 years getting this one sermon out. I says, yeah, but if you're going to do this, you're going to need more than one sermon in your pocket. And then, but it's like Peterson said, it just sort of built up and built up and built up and built up. Oh, and it's also interesting that he's working on musical improv. He talked about that with Michaela too, that he's frustrated when we got this word from the Canadian Supreme Court. It's like, I'm going to do some music, I'm going to write some songs. They're going to be, I can't imagine the songs that he's writing from this stuff. That whole drama is just fascinating. And again, I just cannot imagine Jordan in his social media re-education. Someday someone is going to have, there are going to be numerous biographies about this man, and it's going to be wild.
Every couple of weeks, because I'm on the road so much and moving around, but there is a stream of melody that's running in the back of my mind. It appears to be constant in some ways, because it's there when I play, and that's very interesting. It's interesting to speculate about why that might be the case. You said with this song that it was both melody and lyrics that came to you, and you said that was different from other experiences of musical writing that you've had. So I would like to know how it differed, but I'd also like to know, there's something else you said that's quite curious, which is that when you wrote the song, and perhaps at the moment, I don't know your contractual arrangements at the moment, but that you're not beholden to any record label or any industry. And so I guess one of the things you might suppose is that you think that freed up your creative imagination in a way that was new, and allowed this to sort of spring forth? Like, do you think there's a relationship between the fact that you're not bound by industry contractual obligations, or even by the necessity of serving a particular market? That
Now, my last video, when I talked about don't take the bait, and I talked about Jesus, a lot of people take that in different ways. And it's pretty vague, it's pretty open. A lot of people can take it in different ways. But I think a ton of people, having heard what John Rich just said about basically God told him to write this song, and God has blessed this effort. See, I can put it into other Christian language, and stuff is super easy, and it's changing all kinds of people's lives. He's getting all this possible positive affirmation for it, and God is large and in charge of this, blah 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 blah. And then a lot of people, in terms of how do you know it's God? They would have jumped all over that issue, and Peterson doesn't. And I think that's super smart. He's, okay, there's that, there's this, but let's look at this. And I think it opens up the space quite a bit more, because they then have a really interesting conversation about art and commerce. And I liked what John Rich said. He quoted somebody else that said, it was Petty, and said, how do you write a song? Well, I kind of sit back and I put up my antenna and I wait for a song. You might use a fishing metaphor for something like that. But, I have very similar experiences when I'm making videos. Now, I'm really reticent about sort of one of the sermons I have about you should not take the name of the Lord your God in vain is be a little careful about signing God's name behind my work. Because, I think it's important. I think it's cool. I think it's godly. I think it's all of those things. But let's not be too quick to leverage the reputation of the Almighty for a very fallible human being like me, who is by no means almighty. So there's I'm trying to think of another piece that I wanted to talk about here. Okay, and this part too, Peterson is I think really doing well.
Okay. So let me weave my way through that a bit here. So you started by talking about the fact that when you wrote the majority of the 2,000 songs that you wrote, you did have commercial top 40 success in mind, and were often commissioned specifically to do that. And we talked about the fact that there can be real artistry involved in that. Now, but then it sounds like the additional necessity to toe the party line, let's say, started to put constraints on your creative ability, but also on your conscience, that began to plague you. And you said that one of the things that plagued you about that in particular was your sense that you were giving the wrong message to your boys. And they were pretty young when you started thinking about that. So let me ask you two questions about that. The first is, what risks see, the reason that it bothers me so much to see creative people become ideologically possessed is that the only thing that creative people have is the genuine creativity of their production, right? And that's really the goose that lays the golden eggs. And that's rather a fragile beast. First of all, most people don't have it. High-level creativity is a relatively rare trait. And then it's easily crushed, and it only flourishes under some conditions. And one of the conditions it flourishes under
So I often hear, especially on Twitter, Jordan Peterson, he's a hack. He's just, listen to what he just did here. He's not a hack. He is talking like a psychologist. He is okay. So John Rich has all of these things, and there's tons of interesting things. And me as a pastor, I tend to listen to different things. But Jordan's paying attention to this dynamic.
By all appearances, is something like freedom. Right now, you can maybe put a couple of constraints on it, as we discussed with regards to your commercial aim. But if you keep piling on the impossibilities or the arbitrary restrictions, then you risk doing yourself damage. So two questions there. Like, what did you?
And then the questions of how arbitrary are those restrictions placed on by, again, back to was it Andrew Schultz? The atmosphere, so like Netflix, Netflix would never let this go through because of the atmosphere. And so Sony and Universal and Warner are always thinking about the atmosphere. And he's going to say, no, this is a song that I'm sort of conscience bound. My sons are watching me, and they need to know what kind of man I am, and they need to know how I feel about my faith. Now, one of the regular, it's so interesting. I love doing weekly estuary with a small group of people, because you can really begin to get to know where the people's anxieties are and what the concerns they have. And so one of the things that comes around quite understandably is transmission of the faith from generation to generation. And one of the things that there's been a ton of psychological study with respect to transmission of the faith, and mothers and fathers play different roles in terms of that transmission. You'll always hear about the praying grandma, but a lot of research has gone into how the father expresses their faith with respect to how the children prioritize and value faith. And so one of the really nice thing about John Rich's talk here is that, you know, he doesn't want his sons to see him as just someone who is selling out, or you can even sort of put it on another footing and say he only does music for the money. And again, there's somehow we know that devalues music, that yeah, you can make a lot of money making music, but there's something about music that is above money, and it should be that way. And if you're only writing songs and only making music for the money, and again, and even if, you know, I might have little critiques of John Rich's, certain elements of John Rich's worldview, but, you know, he doesn't have a theological training. Most American Christians just pick up what they hear. And when I listen to people in my church or other churches just telling me what they think, I don't edit them. I don't do to them what I do in this video. Again, you sort of pick on celebrities because they offer themselves up for broader conversation. But I don't edit people when they talk this way because, again, don't take the bait on a whole bunch of little things. Sit and ask your question, what is really the larger things that I want to actually be working on? And so I'm just going to let a lot of little things go by because there's one thing I want to get at. And so what he talks about here is that, you know, his sons are watching him. If music is just about money, then suddenly money's at the top of the hierarchy. And again, I've said many times, one of the most fascinating observations in the Sermon on the Mount that Jesus gives is you can't serve God and mammon. And what that demonstrates is that, no, the truly valuable things, love for money, I don't mean love of money. Let's say you marry a man because he's wealthy, or you know, that basically love is a function of an economic exchange. And ever since Marxism, I'm sure probably before too, there's this deep suspicion, and I often hear people make this. I hear Christian ministers make this. I hear lots of Christians make it. I hear non-Christians make it. But everything can be just reduced to the economics. And that doesn't mean that the economics is an unimportant thing. But unless you have something above economics in your hierarchy, and there should be many things above economics, and whereas, yeah, you should be able to make money playing your music, but if by your actions and your deeds, your music is merely the slave of money, you're showing your boys something.
Notice, if anything, happening to your ability to write creatively under those constraints. And also, like, how did you become aware, for example, that you weren't setting a good example for your boys? And like, how did you discover that or come to realize that?
So under those constraints, your songwriting at that point is completely superficial. It's only to make a check. It's only to make $1. It's only.
See, the muse is devalued beneath the mammon, and I love this part. This I think is dead on right.
Only to get a plaque. It's only to further yourself, which is highly superficial to me. And so when you start talking about my two sons, well, man, that's as deep as you're going to get. I mean, there's nothing more important than that to me. And so when I saw that the example I was setting and that they were going to be following was superficial in nature, that, wow, we know dad's a real McCoy, but dad's willing to go superficial if it means he keeps getting that money and getting those plaques. That is no way to live. I'd rather you be completely broke in your life, poor as a church mouse, but have your constitution about you and have integrity about you and be a real McCoy, as we would call them in the country. I'd much rather my boys be that. I don't care about them, what they do when it comes to financial stuff. And so turning that corner and getting away from those shackles of what the industry was limiting me to turned me loose. I mean, it turned me loose. For a minute, it's almost like, wait, you mean I can actually step over here and nobody's going to pop me? Okay. And so I step over there. Well,
Well, you will get popped. You get popped by different things. You won't get popped by the person for your purse strings. But again, this gets back into the, you don't let a 6-year-old sort of be master of their domain. A 25-year-old who is immature isn't master of their domain. But this is all about, let's say, maturing and mastering. And now that now he's going to have to be his own master, and he isn't going to have these gatekeepers, or he's going to have to be a submaster beneath the Lord, and all of these things. So it's a very sensitive dance between, let's say, this culture of authenticity where he's got to follow what's inside, or you can sort of place sincerity against authenticity and say, okay, well, I am going to authentically express my devotion to a traditional structure and traditional norms and values, and I'm going to live them out. I want to get into this conscience thing a little bit more, though. I definitely wanted to hit this because Jordan sometimes goes to the Church of Laodicea. I don't mean he goes to the Church of Laodicea. I mean he points to the letter to the Church of Laodicea about hot and cold and spit you out of my mouth, and we're going to talk about hypocrisy. Again, this is Jordan sort of, I think, in a really good mode here.
I guess I have 3 questions, really. Like, what gave you the sense that you were leading your boys astray? I mean, they were very young, and the sorts of things that you're talking about are relatively subtle. And so was it guilt on your part, or was it something that you think they could actually see? Or was it something that you were afraid they were going to be able to see? Like, I'm not clear about the actual details, but what was plaguing your conscience? Now, I can understand that you were increasingly uncomfortable with the constraints on your free speech, and obviously that's at least in part because those constraints pose a danger to your creative ability. But I still don't quite exactly understand how it was that you became convinced that you were setting the wrong model, let's say, for your sons. What do you think it was that they were seeing? Was it reflected in the way you were talking to them, or in a bitterness? Like, what was going on?
Yeah, well, I think we've all found ourselves watching the evening news and going, can you believe these people? Can you believe what's going on in our country right now? Or, they'd overhear me talking to my wife about, can you believe what this record label is doing? Or I just got in trouble for doing an interview with this guy. And they're hearing these things. But then I'll gear back up and walk right back out there and go play ball with the exact same people that I've been yelling at the house.
Now, I think he's saying play ball metaphorically, because I think you should play baseball with the people you differ with. I mean, this has been a big thing about Congress. I mean, are people getting together on multiple different layers and levels? So I think he's saying play ball metaphorically instead of play ball physically. You should play, maybe if you did play ball physically with the masters of Sony and Universal and Warner's, maybe, in fact, that personal knowledge could broaden the conversation, and you would actually create a better working relationship.
That's called being a hypocrite. That is the essence of being a hypocrite, which is probably the worst thing you could be.
Okay. Jesus. There's nobody who put hypocrisy as a sin on a map more than Jesus. So you have to say that one thing. And so being a hypocrite is a very dangerous thing. But you can also get some hard-line-isms in here too, which can also be problematic. And part of the beauty of the subtlety about what Jesus does, let's say in the Sermon on the Mount, is that he definitely points out hypocrisy and says, people should have integrity. Integrity is sort of the opposite of hypocrisy. One friend of mine, I remember, he told me why he married the woman that he married, and he's right about her. He said, she's the same person everywhere. And she is. She's a woman of tremendous integrity. But now, you can also push hypocrisy too far. Because, okay, lukewarmism. Okay, so you're not cold, you're not cold. Really what that's getting at is you're always compromising in the wrong way. And what you actually have to do is figure out when to compromise and when not to compromise. And the entire game, the entire trick The morality of all of this is figuring that out. That's sort of the moral relevance realization, figuring out when to stand tall and when to not. Because, again, you can point straight to Jesus. In my opinion, a big part of the reason that Jesus was hated was from the perspective of those who saw the Roman occupation and the influence of Hellenism on God's holy land and God's holy people, that this was in fact a travesty where God's people were being corrupted by Roman soldiers. The whole complaint about prostitutes and tax collectors, we tend to think of prostitutes more in terms of, well, prostitute is someone who sleeps with someone for money. Yes, but in that context, who are they sleeping with? They're sleeping with soldiers. They're sleeping with the enemy. And so their young Jewish girls are being corrupted. Poor Jewish girls are being corrupted by soldiers who have money and are far from home and are sleeping with them. And tax collectors are young Jewish men who are being corrupted by tax farming and collecting Roman money. And what many of the people, let's say, we're going to talk about right and left with respect to Romans and Judean nationalism. What many people wanted was for Jesus to take a firmer line on the culture war issues of his day. And what you find is that Jesus cuts his own lines. But for example, I used this story in the previous video. Woman comes, Jesus is being hosted at a party of a Pharisee. And again, a Pharisee is sort of a religious political party. And they don't wash Jesus' feet. They're sort of a little anxious about Jesus, a little worried about Jesus. Again, in terms of all of the parties, Jesus is probably closest to the Pharisees in terms of a lot of what he believes and does. He believes in the resurrection, unlike the Sadducees, along with the Pharisees. And so Jesus and the Pharisees are actually in many ways sort of close, but they're a little anxious about Jesus. So Jesus is invited as a guest to this party. He isn't extended the hospitality of having his feet washed. And this woman, who is probably sleeping with Roman soldiers, comes in and washes his feet with her tears and her hair. And of course, letting down one's hair. Anne Rice, who wrote these vampire books, does a nice job of that in her biography about Jesus. Her biography of Jesus is a very interesting biography. And then people are taken aback. Well, what are they taking offense with? They're taking offense with that Jesus isn't holding the line on standing up with all the other Jewish nationals of saying, okay, we're going to hold the line against the Romans. But of course, what Jesus does is sort of transcends that line and realizes that both Romans and Judean nationalists are held captive to certain principalities and powers. And so then Jesus uses this as an illustration to say, you didn't extend hospitality to me. And he doesn't say she's doing the right thing in her prostitution, but he doesn't take the position that the others do with respect to her. And so that's a way in which Jesus sort of deals with the principalities and powers. Now, someone might say, well, Jesus, you're a hypocrite because you're wishy-washy in terms of the question of Hellenism or Roman occupation or complicity with the Roman Empire versus Jewish nationalism. And Jewish nationalism could be seen as this is the proper place to be because this is God's holy land and we are God's holy people, and they ought not to be contaminated by Hellenistic ideas and practices and the presence of Roman standards where you've got the birds have nests, birds have perches. That's the Roman eagle on top of that perch. And foxes have holes. Well, what's that? That's all of Herod's palace. Herod was the fox. Birds have perches. Romans have standards. Herod has his palace, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. Now, someone might say, well, Jesus, you're being wishy-washy. You're not hot or cold. You're lukewarm. But it's like, Jesus wasn't being lukewarm. But Jesus also understood that these other two games that the empire and the nationals are playing, that's not the right game either. And he's calling them to a different game. And of course, when Christianity sort of breaks out and becomes this larger religion, and now suddenly when Gentiles can be welcomed by the God of the Jews, well, things change. So again, there's this sort of gospel of hard-line-isms, that hard line itself does not make it right, whether you feel it coming from the inside or you're getting it from the principalities and powers out there. The hard line doesn't make it right. Now, that doesn't mean that Jesus doesn't have hard lines. Read the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount is full of hard lines. In fact, again, you can point to the piece written by in the Reformed Journal. Why can't I remember her name off the top of my head? Basically, the gospel goes to Texas A&M. You can find it on my blog. Tim Keller used to use it as an example too, where she just, in Texas, she just takes a copy of the Sermon on the Mount and gives it to her English, her freshman English students, and says, critique this. Tell me what you think of this. A good many of them hated it. And it's like, well, they're in the Bible Belt in the late 1980s. Shouldn't, according to all kinds of stereotypes, shouldn't they be, saluting because this is Jesus in the Bible Belt and the Sermon on the Mount? Most of the people hated it because they said this is totally unrealistic. Jesus is way too hard line. It's basically their complaint. Jesus is way too hard line. And then others around Jesus said he's way too lukewarm. He's way too wobbly. We need a firm stance against Hellenism and the Roman Empire. That's what we need out of Jesus. And it's like, Jesus doesn't do that. And that's why there's nothing wrong with hard lines. Sometimes you need hard lines. And sometimes you need to compromise. But figuring out when and where, that's the hard thing. And again, that's why I say, well, how can you know this? And this is where I'm sure John Rich and I would be on the same page, that we'll study Jesus. And he and I might come up with some different answers to some things. We'll come up with similar answers to some things, but study Jesus. That's, well, if you're a Christian, Jesus, is your master, and so you study Jesus, and you sort of use Jesus to calibrate these things. Now, Jordan mentions on his talk with Michaela that every week there's going to be a new thing coming out, and the gospel seminar is coming out soon, so Jordan Peterson gospel seminar, that's different from the gospel seminars, but if I say gospel seminar, a few of you with theological education will kind of chuckle, because Jordan's gospel seminar is going to be very different, and I'm super excited about that, super interested. I re-upped my Daily Wire thing basically just for that, but anyway, I wanted to, conscience, still wanted to talk about conscience.
Yeah, well, you see, that's a very interesting observation, because I've just written a new book called We Who Wrestle with God, and it comes out November 12th. And it's a journey through the characterizations of God in 10 Old Testament stories, about 10. There's some forays into New Testament material, but I'm saving most of that for another book. And God is characterized in these stories, at least in part, in two ways. And one is as the spirit of what calls to you, so grabs your interest, compels you forward, it fills you with enthusiasm, makes you want to move towards a goal, makes you want to hit the target properly. And another characterization is the constraints of conscience. And I think about this biologically and instinctively too, because I think that those things dovetail. It looks to me like conscience, the voice of conscience, is something like the voice of the longest possible term game. So you could imagine.
Now, if you go back and you look at what I was talking about in terms of sacred, the longest possible term gain. Okay. What is the future for us for short-lived creatures? So House of the Dragon, is that the Game of Thrones prequel that I'm watching? But anyway, it's got dragons and swords and that kind of stuff. So the new season came out. I had watched the first season, and but it's a long time ago. So usually if a new season comes out, I wait until the whole season is out, and then I rewatch the whole first season and then watch the second season. And in House of the Dragon, you have an aging king who marries his daughter's best friend, which puts some tension between them when he sort of pushed his first wife. He needed a son for an heir. And I mean, it's actually very well done. And so what is the king looking for? What is the king trying to do? And there's all this tension. So he marries his daughter's best friend, and she does start producing young princes. And will he make those princes the heir, or will he keep his very capable daughter? I mean, she proved herself to be a very capable teenage girl. Will he keep her as the heir? And so all the tension is building. I'm not going to give spoilers, but and I was thinking about this dynamic of sacred time and sacred space and the future, and how the future in secular realms sort of works as the sacred. And you can see that also in sort of Jordan Peterson's definition of conscience here.
Imagine voiceactively too, because I think that those things dovetail. It looks to me like conscience, the voice of conscience, is something like the voice of the longest possible term game. So you could imagine that in your situation, there's two forces that are striving inside of you. And one is the forces that say, maintain your relationship with what's essentially high-level commercial success that comes at the price of pleasing the marketplace and also not displeasing the people who control your access to that. And that's...
Now, what Jordan just said there is not a small thing, because if you watch Jordan long enough, Jordan is not an enemy of the marketplace. He's almost always asking people about, he selects people who have had marketplace success, and he asks people about their success, and he uses marketplace success as sort of an indicator of some value, even transcendent value. And in fact, John Rich did this before, when he says, I broke away from the studios and I went my own way and I did this thing exactly how I thought, and look, it's taken off. And so again, you don't want to say, well, everything that takes off is, the devil in his itching ears. You're working that nuance, you're doing that relevance realization. And so you're not going to simply dismiss markets and what they have to say, but in them there are dangers, and there are dangers in the way of the individual, and the individual hard-line-ism, or the individual secret sacred selfism, or the individual cult of authenticity. There's dangers at every turn.
It's not nothing, as you pointed out, but then your conscience comes up and it's saying something like, yeah, but you might be giving up something more important here, and you don't want to do that because that's a bad long-term game. Bad for you, bad for your kids, bad for society. It's a bad social game too. And if you play the longer-term game, you might pay a short-term price, right? That's the price you pay for speaking your mind when there's a certain amount of pressure against doing so.
And again, you can look at this in terms of Jordan Peterson and his fight with the Ontario College of Psychology. Or is it of psychologists? I don't know. You'll correct me in the comment section. Because, well, there's the tension. The tension's right there. And, of course, if you gain the whole world but lose your soul, lose your psyche, you have nothing. And so Jesus takes that tension and he ratchets it up. And, you can understand how all of these tensions they're played out in the Gospels. And Jesus, of course, he's an archetypal figure. He's a limiting figure. I mean, he doesn't just become poor or lose a good job. He loses his life, and he doesn't just lose his life in a way, let's say even Peter and Paul lost his life in a less disturbing way, probably. He being a Roman citizen, he was probably just beheaded. Peter, according to tradition, was crucified upside down because he didn't deem it himself worthy to be crucified in the same way that his Lord was. But, Peterson now sort of growing in his knowledge of, and his curation, his fascination with the Bible and the gospel, all of these tensions come up. And of course, Peterson is so interesting because if you listen to his conversation with Alex O'Connor, he's still just sort of on the boundary line of, can we really talk about eternity? Can we really talk about the age to come? And then when you get to a case like Jesus, what does the resurrection mean? Does it mean that, like Peterson sort of went to the belly of the whale and was in a coma and now is this a resurrected Jordan Peterson? Well, no, certainly not fully, because, he continues in the age of decay. He's not liberated from it. There's just so many interesting questions.
But it's an unbeatable long-term game, in my estimation, if your conscience is clean. Now, you said something interesting, though, too, from the practical perspective, two things. You said that you let go of a sure thing, although you were paying a price for that. But what you gained in consequence were two things. You gained an increase in creative freedom that was at least in part unexpected, right? That you could now make forays into various directions that you had hesitated to tread on before. I was kind of wondering about how that might have made itself manifest musically, because you can imagine that you might have been restricting yourself with regard to the content of the lyrics, but you might have also been restricting yourself with regard to the plethora of musical forms that you might introduce into your music. Like, one of the things that strikes me about your music is that, you cover a very wide range of genres. So I'm curious about whether your willingness to detach yourself from the dictates of the politicized marketplace increased your musical creativity as well as your lyrical creativity. And then there was one other thing. Oh yes, the other thing you said was that the other advantage was that you established a more genuine connection with your audience. And so let's take those apart step by step. So the first thing is, when you freed yourself and you stopped being, in your own words, a hypocrite, what happened to you on the musically creative side as well as the lyrically creative side? And then let's talk about...
And the video's out there and you can watch his answers, but I just wanted to hit some of these points, and my time is done. I don't know how many videos I'll get out this week. It's a big week. We bury Fancy Nancy this week, and Freddie's going to need a fair amount of support. And so if you're a praying person, pray for Freddie. And of course, one of the things with a death, everybody pays attention to what happens at the funeral, or what happens at the calling hours, or what happens at the graveside. But one of the things that you learn as a pastor is that, in fact, people grieve for years, and people's relationships are complicated, and there's a lot of complexity in this situation. And so we'll see, we'll see how it goes. This is a Freddie and his sister at this point, for the first time in their lives, will be without their mother. And their dependence on their mother for a variety of things was complex. And if I don't have a church of thousands that can suddenly marshal the resources of a mega church to sort of support Freddie. And I'm not saying that actually with her death, there will probably be some more financial resources available to him that have not been available to him. Nancy didn't have much money, but their house was paid off, and so the house will be sold. And there is another family member in the extended family who is a lawyer, and there is a trust. And so actually Freddie will have, in some ways, probably better financial and legal resources than he's had his whole life up until now. So in some ways, in those ways that people sort of immediately think of, there'll be some more support for him. But at the same time, we are mysterious creatures, and life is a very complex thing. So anyway, I don't know how many videos I'll get out. No Friday live stream this week. The memorial service is Thursday, which means that I probably won't get hardly any sermon work done Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So it's gonna be a Friday special this week. Oh boy. And I have to all of the sermon work just crunched into one day, and hopefully do a rough draft for Sunday. I've not forgotten my Heidelberg Catechism project. We'll get back at that, and next week things will start to open up a little bit. And there's 2 guys that I owe Randos conversations to because I had to cancel them because Nancy passed. And so, yep, lots of stuff going. So anyway, this was a very interesting conversation, and I thought a good one. So leave a comment. Let me know what you think.